At the beginning of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire had already lost much of its former power. The grandeur of the Tulip era and the victories of Suleiman the Magnificent were now distant memories. Sultan Selim III tried to establish a Western-style modern army, but the Janissaries and those who didn't want to lose their privileges blocked these reforms. In 1807, he was dethroned by the Kabakchi Mustafa rebellion. Once again, the state was consumed by internal conflicts. Amid this chaos, a child who would later leave his mark on history managed to survive in secret: Mahmud. According to legend, he miraculously escaped those who tried to kill him. If he had died that day, the Ottoman dynasty might never have ruled again. But Mahmud survived. In 1808, he was brought to the throne by a powerful provincial leader, Alemdar Mustafa Pasha. He became sultan at the age of just 23, not through a glorious victory, but in the midst of deep chaos. The state treasury was empty, the army undisciplined, and the people restless. For the young sultan, it was a harsh test, but Mahmud understood that the only path to survival was through patience and determination. These two principles would shape his entire life. The people of the empire didn't know him well. Some thought he was weak, others had hope because of his youth. But no one could have imagined that he would later be remembered in history as the Gavur Padishah, the Infidel Sultan. Throughout the 18th century, the Janissary Corps, once the backbone of the Ottoman army, had degenerated. They were no longer disciplined warriors, but had become a rebellious mob, causing unrest whenever they could. They had become the state's biggest problem. Everyone knew that the future of the Ottoman Empire couldn't continue with the Janissary Corps. But no one dared to abolish them, until Sultan Mahmud II. From the very first day he ascended the throne, Mahmud had envisioned the end of the Janissary Corps, which had long been a festering wound in the empire. This wasn't just a dream for him, it was a necessity. He understood well that as long as the Janissaries existed, no true reform could be made and the state would never breathe freely. But to act before the right time would have meant death, even for a sultan. So he waited patiently for years. He observed every rebellion, every uprising, and quietly took notes. He studied the internal factions of the corps, the weaknesses of their barracks, and who each regiment was loyal to, as if gathering intelligence. He built a loyal circle around himself. Beyond the military, he took the pulse of religious scholars, the clergy, and the common people. He knew the public had grown to despise the Janissaries. The shopkeepers were fed up with their arbitrary tyranny. Finally, by the year 1826, Mahmud believed the time had come. Using the creation of a new army as a pretext, he made his move. He announced that a Western-style military unit would be established. This, just like in the era of Selim III, was seen by the Janissaries as a direct threat. And as expected, they revolted once again. But this time, they didn't face a sultan who sought to understand or appease them. They faced a determined leader who had no intention of backing down: Sultan Mahmud II. As the rebellion grew, the Janissaries, as they always did, withdrew to their barracks in Istanbul. But this time, the usual scenario didn't happen. The palace did not back down. Mahmud had made up his mind. Either I destroy this corps, or they destroy me. And for the first time in Ottoman history, a sultan ordered cannons to be fired against his own army. The artillery fire began from Sarayburnu, shaking the skies over Istanbul. The Janissary barracks were the target. The Janissaries were stunned. They thought, as always, they could intimidate and force the palace into submission. But this time, the people had turned against them too. Fed up with their tyranny, the people flooded the streets, shouting one thing: "Enough! You bring no good to this state." Then the flames rose. Barracks were set ablaze one by one. The streets became battlegrounds for days. At every corner, another rebel was captured. Every morning, a new public execution took place. The air of Istanbul was filled with the scent of gunpowder and ash. The Janissaries resisted, but this time they were alone. Neither the palace nor the people stood with them anymore. After days of violent conflict, the Janissary Corps, long considered the backbone of the Ottoman army, was no more. Thousands were killed. The rest fled or were arrested. All that remained of their barracks were plumes of smoke. That day was recorded in Ottoman history as the auspicious incident, Vakai-i Hayriye. But this auspicious event marked not only the end of a military institution, but also a turning point in the consciousness of Ottoman society. For the first time, the people witnessed a complete upheaval of an established order, brought about by the determination of a sultan. For Mahmud II, however, this was only the beginning. The destruction of the Janissary Corps gave him the freedom he had long sought. Without delay, he founded a new army, Asakiri Mansuri Muhammadiye, the victorious soldiers of Muhammad. Western-style military training was introduced. Uniforms were standardized. People in the streets of Istanbul watched this new army with awe and surprise. Some admired the soldiers in fezzes, while others murmured, "Are these really our troops, or just another bunch of Europeans?" But change didn't stop with the military. Mahmud's real challenge began with reforms that touched everyday life. He knew very well, if you want to truly transform a state, you must change not just the army, but also the minds of the people. One of the most radical and controversial reforms was undoubtedly the clothing revolution. From that point on, neither soldiers, nor officials, nor ordinary citizens could walk the streets as before. The fez was declared the new imperial symbol. For state officials, frock coats and trousers became mandatory. Growing a beard was banned. Traditional attire, turbans, robes, religious headgear, wasn't banned outright, but it gradually disappeared. Anyone who entered a government building was now expected to look Western. This wasn't just a change of headwear. It was the dawn of a new era. And across the streets of the Ottoman Empire, this shift was felt like a social earthquake. The sudden disappearance of clothing, customs, and symbols that had been rooted for centuries felt like a disaster for many. In some neighborhoods, people refused to leave their homes to avoid wearing the new attire. Others secretly continued to grow beards. But the state's stance was clear. Not resistance, but compliance was expected. Some welcomed the reforms with excitement, saying, "Now we're like the Europeans." Others whispered in back alleys, "The Sultan has become an infidel." And so, the famous nickname, the Infidel Sultan, emerged during this time. Though whispered as an insult, those words echoed all the way to the palace walls. Because this wasn't just about clothing. It was a battle of identity. A sharp line had been drawn between the old and the new, tradition and reform, east and west. For some, Mahmud's steps were the lifeline pulling the empire out of a swamp, the dream of a modern Ottoman state that could rival the West. For others, it was a betrayal, a loss of the Ottoman soul. Not just garments were changing, but values too. Yet Mahmud didn't shy away from the debates. On the contrary, every criticism made him more determined. He brought strict discipline to state bureaucracy. Bribery was no longer a habit. It was now a crime. Civil servants would receive regular salaries and be punished if they neglected their duties. The machinery of the state was to run on order, not corruption. And Mahmud didn't just think about today. He planned for the future. He established modern institutions focused on medicine, surgery, and engineering, all modeled after Western education systems. He sought to rebuild the Ottoman Empire, not on memories of the past, but on the needs of the future. For Mahmud II, these reforms weren't a choice. They were a last resort for survival. In his eyes, the empire would either transform or perish. While Mahmud was working to implement a massive reform project at home, cracks were deepening across the Ottoman territories. Bringing order to the state's internal structure was difficult enough, but maintaining the empire's presence abroad was proving just as hard. Because now, the Ottoman Empire was fighting not just internal unrest, but a new wave of nationalism spreading across the globe. In the Balkans, long-standing unrest was not calmed by reforms. Instead, it intensified. The rebellion that began in Serbian lands ultimately led to autonomy, a first for the empire. Territorial losses no longer came only through war, but now through diplomacy as well. But the greater threat would not come from the West. It would rise from the South, the Greek Revolution. This was not an ordinary revolt. Across Europe, a wave of romantic nationalism was rising. The Greek struggle for independence became more than a local rebellion. It turned into a cause embraced by European intellectual and political circles. Known as the Hellenic Revival, the movement found resonance in literature, art, and politics. Famous names like Lord Byron, the British poet, went to the battlefield themselves, fighting on the Greek side against the Ottomans. The empire was no longer facing a lone rebellion. It was facing the unified conscience of Europe. To suppress the Greek revolt, Mahmud II turned to the most powerful man in the empire, Mehmed Ali Pasha of Egypt. At the time, Mehmed Ali was not just a provincial governor. He was practically an independent ruler, having built his own power base. In return for his help, Mahmud promised him the province of Syria. Mehmed Ali accepted the deal and dispatched his son, Ibrahim Pasha, along with a modern army and navy, to quash the rebellion. But history would soon remind Mahmud that such help comes at a high cost. In 1827, the joint Ottoman-Egyptian fleet was suddenly destroyed at Navarino Bay by British, French, and Russian warships. This was not a battle. It was an act of the three great powers redrawing the map without consulting the Ottomans. After Navarino, the Ottoman Empire's naval power never fully recovered. Immediately afterward, in 1828, Russia declared war on the Ottomans. The newly formed Ottoman army, still inadequately trained, was rushed into battle and suffered devastating defeats. By 1829, the empire had lost not only territory, but also political prestige. Through the Treaty of Edirne, Greece officially gained independence, marking the first time in centuries that a piece of the Ottoman heartland was torn away, with the support of Europe. But the real threat had yet to arrive. Mehmed Ali Pasha, furious over not receiving Syria after Navarino, openly rebelled. This was no ordinary act of disobedience. It was a powerful, semi-independent state within the empire challenging the central authority. Under the command of his son, Ibrahim Pasha, the Egyptian army crushed Ottoman forces one after another. They advanced steadily through Anatolia, eventually reaching Kütahya, As the gates of Istanbul were under threat, Mahmud II found himself utterly alone. There was no reliable army left, nor any loyal governors. And one of the most powerful sultans in Ottoman history was forced, in desperation, to seek help from Russia, a nation that had long been the empire's historic rival. To many Ottoman bureaucrats, this was nothing short of a humiliation. But there was no alternative at that moment. Russia responded to the call. Russian warships anchored off the coast of Istanbul, forcing Mehmed Ali Pasha to withdraw. But this scene was not merely crisis management. It was a public admission of weakness. The Ottoman Empire was crumbling from within, and now surviving only through external support. Despite Mahmud's sweeping reforms, these back-to-back military and diplomatic disasters shook the empire's internal morale and external reputation alike. As he approached the end of his life, Mahmud struggled with serious illness. Yet he never abandoned his reform agenda. Those who knew him described him as stubborn, harsh, and, when necessary, ruthless. But he was also a visionary. He wasn't afraid to destroy the old, and he boldly worked to build the new. When he died in 1839, he left behind a vast legacy, fierce debates, and a profound transformation process. Just months later, his son, Abdülmecid, proclaimed the Tanzimat Edict. Thus, in truth, Mahmud II was the real architect of the Tanzimat era. He may not have won grand military victories, but he rebuilt a decaying empire and prepared it for a new age. His name was recorded in history with both hatred and admiration. Some dismissed him as the Infidel Sultan, while others hailed him as the man who saved the state. But the real question remains: was Mahmud II truly the savior of the Ottoman Empire, or the one who severed it from its soul? The choice is yours.